it looks like Florida State and Clemson are expected to settle with the ACC. Here's a report that came from Pete Thamel on ESPN yesterday and then carried through On 3 and to a lot of other different outlets. And I have a lot to say about this. So let me guys give you a quick history lesson on how this all went down. Florida State and Clemson are primary revenue generators of the ACC. They signed an agreement with the rest of the league with the ACC in 2016. A TV deal that goes all the way through 2036. The payouts are significantly less now than the payouts for the SEC teams and the SEC as a league. And many of the ACC teams are in the same league as the SEC. Clemson are in the same state. Clemson's in the same state as South Carolina. Florida State and Miami are in the same state as Florida. The gap in payouts is so significant that it gets to a level where Clemson can never compete with South Carolina. Florida State and Miami can never compete with Florida. So they want to get out of the ACC. They would love to join the SEC, maybe even the Big Ten. And they would love to have worked out some sort of agreement where the Big Ten or SEC could help pay their exit fees or they pay it. It just seems like a valuable deal. The problem in all that is that the ACC holds the grant of rights, which would say that even if Florida State and Clemson paid an exit fee and left, like Maryland did with the ACC in 2011, the ACC controls all the media rights to those schools, even if they leave, and the ACC controls those media rights all the way through 2036, and they would need to get a majority of schools to vote against it to kill it. They could not get a majority of schools, which effectively meant they were stuck in the ACC. So they went and sued the ACC. They said that they were coerced into the back contracts in 2016. I never felt that for a while. I mean, I don't know how you could say that you were coerced or tricked. You're not like some small, poor kid signing a contract with a big-time talent agency or record agency or something like that. You were a major school, a major university with a lot of smart people. You could, like the idea that you were tricked into the contract, I didn't buy it. However, the ACC now is willing to settle. Here's what the settlement is. There's a sticking point in the exit fee between $100 and $200 million. We don't know which one it is. There's also an undisclosed number allowed to get out of the grant of rights. Now, this is the big deal. Now the schools can pay to get out of the grant of rights agreement. What that means is that there's a path, if the SEC wants them, for Clemson and Florida State to join the SEC. By those two schools, and that's if the SEC sees value in them. And think about it this way. If the SEC could renegotiate their TV deal with ESPN and make it hinge on them adding Florida State and Clemson, they get more money. They could work with Florida State and Clemson, and the three could come together for them to pay Florida State and Clemson's a portion of their grant of rights exit fee and then their conference exit fee, whatever that may be. It becomes easier in 2031 when the grant of rights, when the exit fee price collapses. Now, the SEC is stuck in their deal through 2034, but the Big Ten gets to re-up their negotiations in 2031 with their TV deal. So the Big Ten will have a lot of money. So they'll be able to swoop down and go for some ACC schools and maybe pay some grant of rights agreements. The SEC will probably feel pressure to do it just to keep up. Essentially, there will be a lot more cards held by Florida State, Clemson, and any other ACC primary schools. So the simple truth, all of that boils down to is this: with this settlement, there is now a path for them to leave the ACC and potentially join the SEC, Florida State and Clemson, by 2031. I'm going to tell you, don't bank on that happening. Not that it won't happen, but Florida State and Clemson may be a little bit too bullish on their chances and not bullish enough on other schools' chances. Let me explain. Part of this agreement and why the Florida State and Clemson settled is what we're calling a brand initiative. So 40% of the ACC revenue is going to be split evenly between all the schools. 60% is what's called a brand initiative. And what that is the schools that bring in the most TV revenue will get more money. So 60% of the TV revenue will be divided based on the ratings you draw that year in the ACC, whatever it is. That's how they're going to do it, which means more money for Florida State and Clemson. That's what they wanted. That's what they needed. Here's the problem. Florida State and Clemson are banking on them being the best draw in the ACC in the future. And they may not be. Because just this past year, not previous years, just this past year alone. Want to know who the biggest draw in the ACC for TV ratings was? Want to know who would have gotten the most money in the brand distribution, in the brand initiative? Georgia Tech. That's right. Georgia Tech would be bringing in more money than Florida State and Clemson. How can Florida State and Clemson sell themselves to the SEC when Georgia Tech's bringing in more bringing in better ratings than them? I'm not done. Want to know who brought in more money to the ACC overall? SMU, who also was a big ratings draw and could only be growing, by the way, after going to the college football playoff this past year. Let's go beyond Georgia Tech and SMU. What about North Carolina? North Carolina just hired Bill Belichick. North Carolina, until today, was going to be featured on Hard Knocks. That fell through. North Carolina is going to have everybody following them for the next few years. You don't think they're going to be a bigger TV draw than Florida State and Clemson? With Bill Belichick at the helm? What if Bill Belichick has success and builds a powerhouse program there? Here comes the issue. What if the SEC prefers North Carolina to Florida State or Clemson? North Carolina is a new market. Florida State and Clemson are in markets they're already in. If North Carolina is also drawing TV ratings, that's a huge win, plus it's extra basketball. If they do go for North Carolina, they have to go for Duke because North Carolina and Duke are tied to the hip. I think the SEC would be fine with that. What about Virginia? Virginia is a new market. What you may not know is that the University of Virginia, along with Louisville, even though Louisville's in a market the SEC is in, actually are two of the schools that joined Florida State and Clemson in generating SEC-level revenue. So Virginia does revenue numbers that Florida State and Clemson do, and the SEC could go grab them and be in a new market. They could reach the DC market at that point. What about Virginia Tech? Virginia Tech is actually a program on the rise under Brent Pry. Many people believe that they could actually be, when they're at their peak during the Frank Beamer years, they're like an SEC program. Blacksburg gets you into the Virginia market and also an SEC cultural town. What about Miami? Miami was a bigger draw last year than Florida State. All these schools I just named could be bigger draws than Florida State and Clemson. And here's what we're not taking into account. How do we know Florida State and Clemson don't become worse draws in the future? Florida State just went 1-11 last year under Mike Norvell. They could be a program drastically on the decline. If that keeps happening, even as they're doing stadium renovations down there, Florida State may completely fall off the map. Clemson did make the college football playoff with an upset in the ACC title, but they are getting less and less relevant under Dabo Swinney by the year. As Tennessee's emerged and other schools emerge, they haven't been able to have the monopoly they once did. They were a flash in the pan 5-year program. It's starting to look more and more like in, Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence in that era, and it looks like that they're not able to maintain that. They could be falling off the map. Taking those things into account, by the time the SEC is ready to poach the ACC, which will inevitably happen, there could be other schools that are a better draw to the SEC. Let's play hot or cold and see which schools would be better of a draw than Florida State and Clemson to the SEC in 7 years. Hot or cold, brought to you by City Heat and Air Conditioning, 50 years in East Tennessee. Integrity matters. City Heating and Air, cityheatandair.com. Let's play hot or cold.
Hi, Mike Davis here with City Heating and Air, reminding you to always dare to compare. Our team provides quality local heating and air service, installation, and maintenance across East Tennessee. We use only the best equipment like American Standard Heating and Air Conditioning for your residential, new construction, or commercial needs. Honesty, dependability, and customer satisfaction have been the cornerstones of our business since 1961. City Heat and Air.
There's your man.
Welcome back to the program. Hot or cold, which schools would the SEC possibly consider over Florida State and Clemson by 2031? Let's get rolling. Let's start with Miami. I'm cold on Miami versus Florida State and Clemson. It's not like Miami brings a new market. I know Florida State and Clemson don't, but neither does Miami technically. And just because Florida State and Clemson seem like worse programs last year, Miami was a bigger draw. That doesn't seem like a long-term thing. So I'm actually cold on Miami. Moving up, Georgia Tech. Similar to Miami, I'm cold on them. Maybe better last year, but again, it's not like they have a new market advantage that Florida State and Clemson don't have. I mean, they're in Atlanta. Georgia is already in that market. The Bulldogs. Georgia Tech has already left the SEC once. even as a program on the rise. I just don't see them getting there. North Carolina, I'm hot on them. I think the SEC is going to see way more value in North Carolina than they will the other school, the Florida State or Clemson, particularly by 2031 when North Carolina could surpass, and yes, I mean surpass Florida State and Clemson in football value. So, you know, that's, I know that's an unpopular thing to think about, but yeah, North Carolina is definitely on my list. If we're talking about hot or cold, who has a better chance? Duke. I'm hot on Duke. Hot on Duke. And that's because they're tied to North Carolina. And I think the SEC, if they were told they have to take Duke to get North Carolina, I think they'd make that move. I do. I think they would accept it. I think they would take Duke with them. Virginia. I'm actually cold on Virginia. They're actually a hot program right now, but as the basketball program wanes over the next few years, it's not the same program it was under Tony Bennett. That revenue that I said they're bringing in won't be there. However, Virginia Tech, I'm hot on them. I think the SEC would go for Virginia Tech. I think the SEC would go for Virginia Tech because of what I just talked about. SMU, I'm cold on them. I don't think SMU brings anything of value to the table. Last year was a flash in the pan. And Louisville, I'm cold on them. There's nothing extra they bring. So Virginia Tech, North Carolina, and Duke are the three schools I think the SEC would entertain adding before they added Florida State and Clemson. So I'm sorry. I'm hotter on those three schools than Florida State and Clemson. Here's Florida State and Clemson's best chance to get to the SEC, though. And this is something that we have to talk about. The SEC's bad TV deal is going to hurt them in poaching the ACC. In poaching the ACC, particularly with the schools they prefer for this reason. The Big Ten, once this revenue exit fee decrease kicks in 2031, the Big Ten will be negotiating a new TV deal. They'll have a lot more money to offer schools and to pay the exit fees. They also have the academic selling point as the one that only wants AAU schools. You could theoretically see the Big Ten go for North Carolina, and if Virginia is rolling at that time, they might go for Virginia too. And they would get those schools before the SEC would. Then they would get Duke. Okay, North Carolina, Duke, and Virginia could all go to the Big Ten before the SEC was, before they go to the SEC, and the Big Ten would be a better draw for them. If that happens, the SEC will then be forced to take Florida State and Clemson to compete. But the problem is the Big Ten can still get into the Florida market because they could get Miami. And maybe just for continuity purposes, they would add Georgia Tech at that point to get into the Atlanta market. And the SEC, out of desperation, has to take Florida State and Clemson, and maybe even Louisville, and definitely Virginia Tech. And just to get into the North Carolina market, maybe take NC State. That's not crazy to think about. All I'm saying is the best chance for Florida State and Clemson to guarantee themselves a spot in the SEC by 2031 is for the Big Ten to poach the ACC before the SEC does and be more successful, and that's a very strong possibility. But we're going to see how it plays out. But you can book it. They're all leaving the ACC by 2031.